The Kalan flagship chorus of iron hung in low orbit above the mining world of Perrin's Reach, its hull scorched black in places that had not been scorched 3 days earlier. Fires bled out from ruptured decks into the vacuum, snuffed instantly, replaced by more fires from deeper within. Escape pods that should have carried Kalan officers to safety spun instead into the planet's gravity well, their guidance systems answering to a different master now. On the bridge, what remained of it, alarms screamed in a language no one was left to translate. This was the end of an empire's arrogance, though to understand how it had come to this, one had to go back 3 days, to the moment a Kalan commander named Threl Vasu decided that humanity was not worth fearing. Threl had expected a war. He had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks of the Dominion fleet, and every campaign before this one had cost him ships, soldiers, and sleep. Perrin's Reach was supposed to be no different. Intelligence reports painted the human colony as stubborn, resourceful, and dangerously adaptive, a species that had clawed its way into the stars through sheer bloody-mindedness rather than any natural gift. Threl had drawn up battle plans for a grinding siege. He had stocked his medical bays. He had briefed his soldiers on human psychology, warning them that these creatures fought hardest when cornered. None of it mattered. When the Dominion fleet dropped out of slip space above Perrin's Reach, the colony's defense grid powered down within the hour. A single transmission followed, offering unconditional surrender, signed by a colony council Threl had never heard of and would come to care very little about. He remembered standing on the observation deck, watching his drop pods descend through an atmosphere that offered no resistance at all, and feeling something between triumph and disappointment. There had been no battle. There had only been a door, opened wide, and 41,000 humans standing quietly on the other side of it, waiting to be told what came next. His second-in-command, a wiry, anxious Kalan named Ithic, had not shared his commander's satisfaction. Ithic belonged to a caste bred for suspicion, and suspicion was not a comfortable thing to carry through an easy victory. "Commander," he had said, watching the surrender broadcast loop for the 4th time, "no species capitulates this quickly. Not without leverage. Not without a plan." Threl had waved the concern away the way he waved away most things Ithic said. Fear was a currency among lesser species, he explained, and humans had simply done the math. Their world was overwhelmed, their fleet was non-existent, and death was not a rational choice when survival was on the table. It was, in Threl's mind, proof of weakness rather than strategy. He ordered the population processed and prepared for relocation. The destination was a moon called Ashvane, a blistered, sulfur-choked rock orbiting a dying red giant on the edge of Dominion space. Ashvane held no atmosphere worth breathing and no beauty worth mentioning, but beneath its crust ran veins of corvexite, a volatile isotope that powered every faster-than-light drive in the Dominion fleet. Refining it was dangerous work, the kind the Kalan preferred not to risk their own citizens on. Conquered populations existed, in the Dominion's calculus, precisely for this purpose. Humans would replace the Vekari slaves who had died there the cycle before, and Threl's fleet, refueled and resupplied, would be back at the war's front lines within a week. Within 12 hours of the surrender, every human above the age of 16 had been fitted with a neural dampening collar, a heavy biomechanical ring that clamped around the neck and monitored biometric activity for signs of aggression. The collars could deliver a disabling shock at the press of a button, or something far worse if a captive proved truly troublesome. Kalan engineers considered them elegant. They were cheap, effective, and had never once failed to keep a labor population compliant. Among the humans marched into the staging yards of Ashvane was a woman named Mira Kesson, unremarkable by any measure the Kalan cared to take. She was neither young nor old, neither strong nor frail, and she moved through the registration lines with the stooped, unhurried gait of someone resigned to her fate. The Kalan processing officer barely glanced at her file before stamping her designation as records clerk, non-essential, a classification that would keep her far from anything resembling scrutiny. It was, Mira thought as the collar closed cold around her throat, exactly the mistake she had been counting on. Beside her in the yard stood Dax Corin, a broad-shouldered man with the kind of face that looked perpetually tired even at rest, the sort of face that invited underestimation. Before the surrender, Dax had run logistics for half the colony's mining operations, coordinating supply chains and shift rotations across a dozen sites. Now he was simply foreman, a title the Kalan assigned him because someone needed to relay orders to the human workforce, and because Dax had a talent for looking beaten without actually being broken. He caught Myra's eye once across the yard, the barest flicker of acknowledgement, and said nothing. They had agreed, back when the surrender was still just an idea being argued over in a bunker beneath Perrin's reach, that the less they spoke to each other where cameras could see, the better. The first day on Ashvane began in fire and noise. The refinery's lower levels were a maze of extreme heat, choking fumes, and machinery that shrieked without pause, built for Vekari physiology and only crudely adapted for human hands. The task was to calibrate the magnetic containment fields that kept raw corvexite from destabilizing during extraction, work the Kalan themselves refused to touch. Threll had expected chaos. He had expected collapse, resistance, perhaps a few dramatic and useless deaths that would remind the rest of the workforce why obedience was the only sensible choice. What he got instead, watching from the clean, climate-controlled comfort of his command deck, was something closer to unsettling. The humans organized themselves without being told. Dax moved through the refinery floor assigning shifts, adjusting rotations, matching skills to tasks with an efficiency that seemed almost rehearsed. Nobody needed to be threatened into working. By the 8th hour, a repair team had not only fixed a malfunctioning drill the previous workforce had abandoned as unsalvageable, but improved its output by a margin the Kalan engineers found difficult to explain. "They're adapting faster than projected," Ithik reported, hovering at Threll's shoulder with the data pad trembling slightly in his grip. "Sector 4 is already running above baseline capacity, and the shift isn't finished." Threll allowed himself a thin smile. He had heard that humans possessed an almost compulsive need to optimize their surroundings, an evolutionary hangover from a species that had spent its early history clawing survival out of hostile environments. Here was the proof, playing out on the monitors in front of him, and Threll saw in it nothing but confirmation of his own theory: fear, properly applied, produced obedience, and obedience produced results. He ordered the daily quotas increased by 20%. Let them prove exactly how resourceful they were when the alternative was failure. Down in the refinery, in the narrow gap between two towering corvexite storage tanks, Mira Kesson knelt in the dark with a terminal built from salvaged drill components and a stolen bioscanner casing. The records clerk designation had given her something far more valuable than safety. It had given her access, low-level, unglamorous, easily dismissed access to the refinery's administrative logs, the kind of systems no Kalan officer would ever think to guard carefully because no Kalan officer imagined a slave capable of understanding them. Mira had spent the first day of forced labor doing exactly what her caller's file claimed she would do. She had also spent it mapping, sentence by sentence, the architecture of a security network the Dominion had built to be unbreakable from the outside, and had never once considered defending from within. She did not tell Dax everything, not yet, not where a camera might catch the shape of the conversation. But that night, in the brief window between shift rotations when the barracks lights dimmed and the collar's biometric sensors logged nothing more alarming than exhausted, steady heartbeats, she allowed herself a single thought, quiet and certain. Threll Vasu believed he had conquered a colony of frightened miners. What he had actually done was hand 41,000 engineers, technicians, and systems architects direct physical access to the fuel source of his entire war effort, and then, in his confidence, look away. Day 1 was over. Somewhere above Ashvane's poisoned sky, Threll Vasu slept soundly, already composing the report that would earn him his next promotion. He had no way of knowing that the numbers he found so impressive, the quotas exceeded, the efficiency displayed, were not evidence of fear at all. They were reconnaissance, disguised as obedience, and the clock the humans were racing against was not the one counting down to the fleet's departure. It was the one counting down to the moment they no longer needed to pretend. Cantillon architected narrative continuation maintaining voice and momentum. Day 2 on Ashvane began the way Day 1 had ended, with heat, noise, and a production ledger that refused to make sense to anyone reading it from orbit. By mid-morning the yields from Sector 4 had climbed past 400% of baseline, a number so far beyond expectation that Overseer Rennick Dola, Threll's superior stationed at the Dominion's core administrative hub, opened a live transmission demanding an explanation. His holographic image flickered across Threll's office in sharp, impatient blue light. "Explain these figures, Commander," Rennick said, his mandibles clicking with the particular irritation of someone who suspected he was being lied to. No labor population operates at this efficiency without either extraordinary incentive or extraordinary deception. Which is it? Threll straightened, choosing his words with the care of a man building his own legend in real time. Neither, Overseer. The human workforce possesses an obsessive drive toward optimization. It appears to be instinctive rather than motivated. They have restructured our cooling protocols using principles our own engineers overlooked. He did not mention that he found the humans' competence faintly embarrassing, an inconvenient truth buried beneath the far more satisfying story of Kaelan dominance producing results. Rennick's projection studied him a moment longer, then dissolved with a curt instruction to have the fleet fully refueled and ready to depart within 2 days. Threll exhaled once the light vanished, allowing himself the small luxury of relief. It was Ithic who ruined the moment, arriving moments later with a data pad clutched too tightly against his chest, his antennae twitching in the agitated rhythm Threll had learned to associate with problems he did not want to hear about. "Commander, the central grid is registering fluctuations. Small ones. A fraction of a volt, repeating across the network at irregular but structured intervals." Threll waved a hand, already dismissing it as he had dismissed every other warning Ithic had brought him since the surrender. "Machinery strain," he suggested, the inevitable consequence of pushing drills built for Vekari hands to 4 times their rated output. "That was my assumption as well," Ithic pressed, refusing to be waved off this time, until I mapped the pattern. "Commander, the fluctuations form a sequence. They repeat in prime numbers." The word landed with more weight than Threll expected. Random noise did not organize itself into primes. Randomness, by its nature, could not. He took the pad from Ithic's claws and studied the jagged little graph himself, feeling for the first time since the surrender a thin, unfamiliar thread of doubt. "Bring me the foreman," he said. Dax Corin was dragged into the commander's office an hour later, his wrists bound in magnetic restraints, his collar flashing an amber warning light that meant the device had detected elevated stress and was, for the moment, simply watching. He hit the polished floor hard when the guards released him, and did not immediately rise, playing the posture of a man already broken long before he had a reason to be. Threll circled him slowly, the way he had circled 100 prisoners before, searching for the particular flavor of fear that told him how far a subject could be pushed before the information stopped being reliable. "Foreman Corin," Threll said, crouching to bring his sharp-boned face level with the humans. "Your people have shattered every quota I set. I find myself wondering why a population so recently conquered would work so hard to please its conquerors." "We want to survive, Commander," Dax answered, his voice carrying the practiced tremor of genuine terror, though what actually shook in his chest was something colder and far more deliberate. "You said if we worked, our families back on the Reach would be spared. We're just trying to prove we're worth keeping alive." "Then explain the power grid," Threll said. "My security officer believes your people are using our own machinery to transmit a coded signal." Something flickered behind Dax's eyes, gone before it could be read as anything but panic. "Power draws," he said quickly. "We diverted auxiliary current from the cooling vents to keep the containment field stable at your quota levels. If we hadn't, the whole sector would have overheated 3 cycles ago. Check the thermal logs. We saved your refinery, not sabotaged it." Threll's hand moved before his composure caught up with his temper, thumb pressing the shock command on his wrist console. Dax's body seized, collapsing against the floor in a spasm of genuine agony, and for a moment the performance and the pain became indistinguishable even to the man experiencing them. Ithic, still hunched over the thermal records at the office console, called out before Threll could press the command a second time. "Commander. The core temperature in Sector 4 did spike 3 hours ago. A manual diversion is logged. It matches his account precisely." Threll straightened, looking down at the human coughing blood onto his floor, and felt the doubt from moments earlier curdle into something almost like embarrassment. It was, he told himself, exactly the kind of overreaction Ithic's paranoia inspired in him. A crude species solving a crude engineering problem. Nothing more. "See that it does not happen again without authorization," Threll said, already turning away, already reaching for the version of the story that let him remain the clever, controlled architect of an efficient conquest rather than a commander who had just tortured a man for saving his own refinery. Dax was dragged out moments later, and Threll allowed the matter to close in his mind the way a door closes on a room he had no further interest in entering. He did not know, could not have known, that the shock he had delivered through Dax's collar had done more than cause pain. Every collar on Ashvane had been quietly linked, weeks of patient, invisible work by Mira Kesson turning 41,000 supposedly independent monitoring devices into a single distributed network, indistinguishable from background telemetry to anyone not looking for it. An administrative override, the kind reserved for punishing a slave directly from a commander's own console, required a burst of priority authentication to reach the collar grid. That authentication, routed through systems Mira had spent 3 days quietly mapping from the inside, had done exactly what she needed it to do. It had handed her terminal, hidden behind a Corvexite storage tank 2 levels below Threll's office, a fleeting but real window into the fleet's own command architecture. She watched the access indicator shift from red to green with the same stillness she had maintained through every hour of forced labor, betraying nothing. Dax had taken the hit, as they'd known someone would eventually have to, and in doing so had opened the very door the Kaelin believed only they controlled. The final day began with an efficiency that would have made Threll proud, had he understood what it actually represented. Fuel transfer completed ahead of schedule. Umbilicals retracted clean. The fleet's drives hummed with freshly refined Corvexite, and Threll stood on his bridge composing, in his head, the report that would surely secure his promotion to Fleet Admiral. 72 hours. A colony conquered, a workforce relocated, quotas obliterated, an entire armada refueled. It read, in his imagination, like the opening chapter of a legend. Below, in the poisoned dark of Ashvane's refinery floor, Mira Kesson and Dax Corin stood together for what both of them understood might be the last quiet moment before everything changed. "They're detaching the fuel lines," Dax murmured, watching the distant lights of the orbital tethers withdraw. "He thinks he's leaving." "Let him think that," Mira said. Over the preceding 2 days, the humans of Ashvane had not merely been extracting Corvexite. Using the access won through Dax's suffering, Mira had embedded a cascading instability into the isotope's magnetic signature at the molecular level, a flaw invisible to any scan the Kaelin thought to run, because no one had ever needed to scan for sabotage from workers too frightened, in their estimation, to attempt it. Every drop of fuel now filling the Dominion fleet's tanks carried the seed of its own failure, timed to a signal the collar network was prepared to deliver the instant the fleet moved to jump. At the 20-minute mark before slipspace ignition, that signal went out. It did not arrive as an explosion, not at first. It arrived as a whisper through systems the Kaelin had built to be perfectly, arrogantly closed, a whisper that told every collar on Ashvane to stop suppressing and start transmitting, and told every corrupted fuel cell across Threll's armada to destabilize at once. The chorus of iron shuddered as its first reactor buckled, then a second, fire chasing itself down decks meant to be invulnerable. Threll felt the floor lurch beneath him and understood, in the space of a single disbelieving heartbeat, that the numbers Ithic had shown him, the prime stuttering through his own power grid, had never been noise at all. They had been a countdown, and he had spent it congratulating himself. On the surface below, the collars fell silent and then, deliberately, fell away, their locking mechanisms overridden by the same access that had betrayed the fleet above. 41,000 humans who had spent 3 days performing defeat rose instead into the ash-choked light of Ashvane, no longer laborers, no longer property, simply people standing in the wreckage of an empire's certainty. Word of the uprising did not stay contained to one poisoned moon. It rode outward through the same compromised relays the Dominion had used to broadcast its own conquests, reaching colony after colony still wearing collars of their own, carrying with it a single unmistakable truth: humanity had never surrendered at all. It had simply been waiting for the door to open wide enough to walk through. Threl Vasu did not live to file his report. What survived of the chorus of iron drifted burning above Ashvane, a monument not to human weakness but to the particular, fatal cost of assuming that quiet obedience and quiet planning were ever the same thing.